Who was Edith Stein?
Edith Stein, 1891–1942, was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1998 as Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. She was born into an observant Jewish family in the Central European region of Silesia, which was then part of the German Empire. In 1932 she denounced the Nazi regime to Pope Pius XI. She converted to Roman Catholicism in 1922 and was received into the Discalced Carmelite order in 1934 in a retaliatory move against Jewish converts in the Netherlands, where the Carmelites had sent Stein for safety. She and her sister Rosa were transported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. They died there in the gas chamber in 1942. Stein was a student of Edmund Husserl, 1859–1938. First at Göttingen University and then at Freiburg, where she became his assistant. Her doctorate was on the problem of empathy. She became a faculty member at Freiburg University after working with Martin Heidegger in preparing Husserl's manuscripts for publication. As a Jewish woman, she was barred from further postgraduate studies at Freiburg and other German universities. She finally gave up her assistantship to Husserl and began to teach in Catholic girls' schools. Learning about Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, and Catholic philosophy in general. She did become a lecturer at the Institute for Pedagogy at Munster, but had to give it up due to anti-Semitic laws in 1933, the same year that her former colleague Martin Heidegger, 1889–1976, was made rector of Freiburg University. The miracle Edith Stein is supposed to have performed that of curing a child who had overdosed on acetaminophen in response to a prayer from relatives is disputed by some Jewish groups who claim it is not clear whether she is a genuine martyr. Her legacy includes numerous writings, some of which were translated into English in the 1980s and 1990s. Life in a Jewish Family, her unfinished autobiographical account, 1986. On the Problem of Empathy, 1989, Essays on Women, 1996, and The Hidden Life, 1993. Stein also wrote Knowledge and Faith, Finite and Eternal Being. An Attempt to an Ascent to the Meaning of Being, Philosophy of Psychology and the Humanities. Self-Portrait in Letters, which have not yet been translated into English or published.
What is Sufism?
Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam. Its classical period, or Golden Age, was from 1000 to 1500. Sufism is believed to have branched out from Baghdad to spread through Persia, India, North Africa, and Spain. The movement supported lodges and hospices for students, Sufi adepts, and others visiting on retreat. Sufi practitioners were expected to go through different levels of spirituality. First were the stations, requiring acts of will and actions to suppress individual egos and attachment to and desire for worldly things. This would lead to God's grace. Once God's grace was granted, it could be experienced individually as love, mystical knowledge, or the loss of ego consciousness. Sufism began as a marginal practice but was accepted by Islamic leaders in the 11th century. Mainly through Al-Ghazali's, 1058 to 1111, efforts. Sufism then developed along distinct practical and intellectual directions. The practical paths required training in religious formulas and initiation into orders. It was accompanied by many fraternal and social organizations that continue in the present Islamic world. The intellectual path developed philosophical terminology and absorbed Neoplatonic influences. Culminating in Ibn Arabi's, d. 1240, system of theosophy. Within that system, God was held to be the only being. Everything else in existence was the result of his self-manifestation. The individual who could identify with all of God's self-manifestations would have the goal of becoming the perfect man, thus far attained only by the Prophet Muhammad. It is perhaps ironic that this intellectual path of Sufism developed when Al-Ghazali had embraced Sufism as part of a belief that knowledge and reasoning was not a reliable way to experience God.
What was Hobbes' idea of the social contract?
The social contract was Hobbes' solution to the unpleasantness of life in the state of nature. It was an agreement among citizens to give up their individual powers to harm one another and transfer all of those powers to the sovereign, or Leviathan. In return, the sovereign would keep order, which would enable all the benefits of civilized life, such as a just legal system, education, marriage, security in property, and a flourishing of the arts and sciences. Hobbes' Leviathan, though, was to have totalitarian powers over his subjects, including the right over their lives, censorship, the right to draft them into military service, and to impose any other necessary burden of government. The only rights retained by subjects were the rights to preserve themselves and resist imprisonment or execution. Laws were literally the commands of the sovereign. Once the sovereign was made the irrevocable gift of power from the people, the only thing that could bring down the government would be its self-abdication or defeat by foreign enemies.
Who was Jean Baudrillard?
Jean Baudrillard, 1929, is a social theorist who writes about the absence of the kind of educated public discourse described by Jürgen Habermas, 1929, in pessimistic but elegant and evocative prose. He is, like Richard Rorty, 1931 to 2007, a very readable postmodernist, but less sanguine. Baudrillard's thought on terrorism in the Shadow of the Silent Majority, 1982, and the Spirit of Terrorism, and Requiem for the Twin Towers, 2002, identifies it as a media manipulating appropriation of public attention in a culture where only the spectacle is taken seriously. This is not a frivolous view insofar as it is based on a thoroughgoing analysis of contemporary life as in large part virtual, made up of simulacra of previous forms of human existence. An example of this would be the way that newly constructed old towns are simulacra of historical places. And American pizza is a simulacrum of Italian food. This is apparently not just a question of things lacking authenticity, according to Baudrillard, but of a mass preference for virtuality instead of reality. Thus in The Gulf War did not take place, 1991, he describes how experiences of the First Gulf War, even and especially for the troops, were mediated by its representation on television, radio, and other media forms. According to externally determined scripts that only captured bits and pieces of the actual experience.
Who was A. J. Eyre?
Sir Alfred Jules, Freddie, Eyre, 1910–1989, was the British logical positivist who became famous for his language. Truth and Logic, 1936, which was followed by The Problem of Knowledge, 1956. Eyre's main contribution was to relate logical positivism to traditional philosophy, which in no uncertain terms resulted in a devastating attack on metaphysics, ethics, and religion. The attack was on the meaning of terms used in these fields and resulted in the claim that they were meaningless. Eyre was the Grote Professor of the Philosophy of Mind and Logic at the University College London from 1946 until 1959. And after that the Wickham Professor of Logic at the University of Oxford. From 1951 to 1952 he was president of the prestigious Aristotelian Society. In 1973 he became a Knight in the Legion of Honor. Eyre's publications include Philosophical Essays, 1954, The Concept of a Person and Other Essays. 1956, The Origins of Pragmatism, 1958, Metaphysics and Common Sense, 1969. Russell and Moore, The Analytical Heritage, 1971, Probability and Evidence, 1972, Bertrand Russell. 1972, The Central Questions of Philosophy, 1973, Hume, 1980, Philosophy in the 20th Century. 1982, Freedom and Morality and Other Essays, 1984, Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1986, Part of My Life. 1977, and More of My Life, 1984, as well as numerous articles on related topics.
What makes the concerns of these historically disadvantaged groups part of philosophy?
When philosophers take up these concerns, as many have in recent decades, they become part of the official curriculum of philosophy in higher education. In addition, the issues raised require the methods of both analytic and continental philosophy to resolve. Some of these issues are ethical and others are directly related to political philosophy and public policy, both of which are now part of the canon of contemporary philosophy.
Why were the great 17th century philosophers and scientists bachelors?
They were either relatively poor, Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, or prohibited from marrying because they were priests. Fathers Marin Mersenne 1588–1648 and Pierre Gassendi 1592–1655. Or it was a tradition for men of learning not to have their own families. For example, Oxford dons were not allowed to marry at that time, and the 7 Fellows of Gresham College, founded in 1558, were all bachelors. Another reason might have been the prevailing beliefs about the nature of women. Women were not allowed to be scholars and wives, and family life was not only considered a distraction for men of learning, but sexual relations were believed to be intellectually weakening for scholars.
What was Al-Kindi's main contribution to philosophy?
Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, c. 800–850, known in Latin as Al-Kindus, had both a noble heritage and an important position in the Caliphate, the governing body representing Islamic leaders, headed by the Caliph. He promoted the introduction of Western philosophy into the Arabic world, with a focus on Plato and Aristotle. Unlike his successors, he believed that there was a literal correspondence between the metaphysical writings of the ancient Greeks and parts of the Quran. His work was closer to Neoplatonism than Aristotelianism, and the tradition he began is contrasted by scholars to that of Mato Ibn d. 940, who founded a school of Aristotelianism in Baghdad.
What was the Invisible College?
In 1645 Robert Boyle, 1627–1691, and other younger scientists met weekly over lunch to discuss current scientific news about research in England and Europe. They called themselves the Invisible College. They discussed the Copernican theory, William Harvey's evidence for the closed circulation of blood, barometric experiments with mercury, and studies of magnetism. After England's King Charles I was beheaded, this group, and their friends, who had academic posts at Oxford, organized the Philosophical Society of Oxford. Following a lecture on astronomy at Gresham College by Christopher Wren, 1632–1723, in 1660. Plans were made to found a college for providing physio-mathematical learning. Charles II approved their plans within a week. There were 115 original members. 1/3 were scientists, and the first president was Lord Brunnecker, the leading mathematician of the day. This was the Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge. It was presented with a silver mace by King Charles II at its inaugural meeting on July 15, 1662. It exists to this day as an independent academy for scientific knowledge in the United Kingdom.
What was Sigmund Freud's interpretation of hysteria?
At first, Freud, along with his mentor Joseph Breuer, advanced the hypothesis that people suffering from hysterics have buried memories of trauma. Treatment consisted in recovering those memories and a cathartic discharge of the affect or emotion associated with them at the outset. Freud thought that the source of the repression was sexual molestation by male relatives. He revised this seduction theory when he realized that if the sole cause of hysteria was repressed memories, there was no reason why it should not resolve itself by being discharged in hysterical symptoms. Taking a page from Franz Brentano, and perhaps Alexius Meinong, 1853 to 1920, as well. He theorized that it could be fantasy revealing itself in the form of repressed desires that was the key. This led to Freud's Oedipal theory.
What was Alexius Meinong's psychological theory?
Meinong divided mental experience into act, content, and object. He worked on the basis of Brentano's theory of intentionality, whereby all mental states intend objects. The mental act, or act element, is the way that the subject is directed toward the object, whereas the specific content, or content element, is its focus in that case. For example, it is a different act to think of an apple versus to desire an apple. Thinking of an apple and thinking of a car is a difference in content. And going from one to the other is a change in focus. Meinong's object theory bypassed traditional ontology because as intended objects, in the sense of Franz Brentano 1837 to 1917, it was not necessary that all objects exist. In fact, Meinong stressed a bias toward existence in the history of metaphysics, which he called a prejudice in favor of the actual. Each object has a socion, or character, which is given through its nuclear features. Because objects truly possess their characters, even statements about non-existent objects can be true. Because how objects are is independent of their existence. For example, a pink unicorn is genuinely pink, even though unicorns do not exist.
Is Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative different from the Golden Rule?
Yes, it is. According to the Golden Rule, we should act as we would have others act toward us. If our tastes are perverted or we do not care for our own welfare, The Golden Rule could permit acts of depravity and violence, but such acts could never be willed categorically. Moreover, Kant's system is strongly based on individual good. Will toward the community of all other rational individuals. There is a debt to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, 1712–1778, idea of the common good here. Indeed, Kant greatly respected Rousseau's moral philosophy.
Who were the principal sophists?
Where were many more sophists in the changing Greek society of the 5th century B.C.E. than during other periods. Based on ancient secondary sources, the main ones, whose home base was in Athens, were Gorgias of Leontini, c. 485–380 BCE, Protagoras of Abdera, c. 490–420 BCE, Hippias of Elis, c. 460–c. 400 BCE, Prodicus of Ceos, c. 465–415 BCE, and Thrasymachus, c. 459–400 BCE.
What was John Dewey's theory of art?
First, Dewey thought that inquiry is an art, and he rejected what he called the spectator theory of knowledge, whereby knowing is believed to be passive contemplation. According to Dewey, ordinary human life itself is a form of art, because it is permeated with aesthetic qualities in human experience. For Dewey, all experience, or anything that can be called an experience, has an aesthetic quality that can be directly appreciated. An experience has an immediacy that is directly felt or had, and which unites its constituents into the same whole. Dewey meant by this that we are not aware of the physical or chemical aspects of our experience, but of holistic actions and qualities. For example, the runner does not experience her sprained ankle in the same way that the sports doctor examining her does. She has a united qualitative experience of strain and pain, whereas the sports doctor understands her condition in terms of which exact tissues have been damaged. Dewey called the aesthetic qualities of experience tertiary qualities, because experience is a kind of transaction. The aesthetic quality of an experience can change and become more meaningful toward a consummation. A consummation is the reconstruction of an experience by intelligence, for example, solving a problem. What is not aesthetic according to Dewey is what is slack or overly rigid. There is nothing in either scientific inquiry or practical action that precludes the presence of aesthetic qualities.
What were Wollstonecraft's main political ideas?
In vindication of the rights of men. 1790, she argued against Irish statesman and political theorist Edmund Burke's 1729 to 1797, conservative attack on the ideals of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. Her claim that Burke's endorsement of custom and tradition implied that slavery was acceptable made her famous overnight. Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, in which Wollstonecraft sounded a clarion call for the recognition of women as human beings, was innovative in its progressive thought.
Does everyone now believe the scientific revolution was good for humanity?
Few can deny the value of an objective, factual understanding of the natural world. Modern technology that resulted from this knowledge has prolonged life, added to comfort, and made all human beings more mobile. There is also an understanding that knowledge should be open and that science is subject to revision, which goes back to the early days of the Royal Society. However, in the second half of the 20th century, the objectivity of early modern science and its values were questioned by historians and cultural critics. Concerning the high value placed on experimentation, for example, it has been discovered that many of the experiments reported by Galileo, 1564 to 1642, and Boyle, 1627-1691, were thought experiments from which they deduced the facts, instead of having directly observed them. And Newton, 1643 to 1727, himself did not actually base his three laws of motion on experimental data, as much as he logically deduced them from more abstract theoretical commitments. On the cultural side, Francis Bacon's 1561 to 1626 perspective was based on assumptions that Earth and its creatures were all raw material for the manipulation and use of mankind. There was no sense that nature had value in its own right. In addition, some feminist critics have viewed the scientific revolution as a radical turn away from an ancient and medieval view of Earth as a living, organic whole, or mother to all who lived on it. They claim that this change in perspective privileged aggression and violence as virtues, compared to harmony and nurturance. Many crafts such as tanning, dyeing, and brewing, but most important, midwifery, became closed to women, as male practitioners took them over. Based on more scientific principles, and moved them out of private households.
What is consequentialism?
Consequentialism is the 20th century version of 19th century utilitarianism. The utilitarian moral system held that we should act so that the greatest pleasure or happiness for the greatest number results, with everyone counting for one and no one counting for more than one. G. E. Moore's 1873 to 1958, ideal utilitarianism specified that the goods we should Seek as the result of our actions our aesthetic experiences and relations of friendship. Consequentialism is a more general form of utilitarianism that holds that we should act so as to bring about the best consequences, or act to maximize the results. Contemporary consequentialists often speak of preference satisfaction as the ultimate consequence that has intrinsic value. Preference satisfaction is getting what one wants. There is also discussion about the distribution of consequences. Whether it is better that all involved get equal shares or whether it is sufficient if the total good or average good is increased. Act consequentialism specifies that we should do the action that has the best consequences. And rule consequentialism specifies that we should do the action that is an instance of the rule that has the best consequences. All of these issues and others have been discussed in J.J.C. Smart, 1920. And Bernard Williams, 1929-2003, Utilitarianism, For and Against. 1973, and Samuel Scheffler's, 1951, The Rejection of Consequentialism, 1994. There have also been attempts to relate consequentialism to ordinary language philosophy. Most notably by R. Hare, 1919-2002.
Why did the Pythagoreans avoid fava beans?
Many reasons have been given for why the Pythagoreans avoided fava beans. A belief that fava beans contain the souls of the dead, the resemblance of the seed in the bean to a human embryo, so that eating them would be like cannibalism. Fava beans seem to have the shape of testicles or the gates of hell. They evoke oligarchy or rule by wealth because they were commonly used to draw lots. And they allow part of the soul to escape in causing wind or gas. Fava beans were the only beans available in Europe before the discovery of the Americas. Modern research has shown that some Mediterranean populations are deficient in G6PD enzyme. And 1/5 of those with the deficiency suffer kidney damage if they eat fava beans. On the other hand, young fava beans contain levodopa, which in controlled doses can be an effective treatment for Parkinson's disease.
Why do some people consider Martin Heidegger to be an existentialist?
In Being and Time, 1927, Heidegger analyzed the human being or Dasein, which in German means being there. Heidegger's insight was that Dasein cannot be understood as a biological thing because its main objects of concern, which is a fundamental structure of what it is, are always somewhere other than where Dasein itself is. Although Dasein in its being is concerned for its own being, understood in the ordinary sense as life, its own being is caught up in the world. Furthermore, Dasein fails to understand its own being authentically, because in its ordinary existence it accepts the interpretation of its being that has already been constructed by the they, or the mass mind. The they is particularly mistaken about the nature of death.
What was or is natural law?
Natural law, or the law of nature, is a set of rules for human actions. Usually posited as having a divine source. As a universal moral and political code, natural law was first conceptualized by Stoic philosophers, who believed that natural law was part of the fundamental structure of the universe. Some early thinkers believed that natural law applied to animals as well as humans. Christian theorists later took up the idea of natural law as self-evident principles of human behavior that could be known only by rational beings. Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, thought that human reason could reveal God's intentions for how we ought always to conduct ourselves so as to preserve the common good, or the good of the community. Following natural law is an important part of obedience to God. The particular laws of nations and peoples might differ, but the basic principles of natural law are universal.
Who was Kurt Gödel?
Kurt Gödel, 1906–1978, is famous for his theorem about mathematical systems, which appeared in a 1931 article titled On Formally Undecidable Propositions in Principia Mathematica and Related Systems. Originally published in German in the 1931 volume of the journal Minutschrift für Mathematik, Monthly Journal of Mathematics. According to Gödel's theorem, every formal, mathematical or logical system is incomplete because there can always be a sentence expressing a truth that can't be proved in the system. To prove his theorem, Gödel invented a method for correlating formulas in logic with positive integers.
Who were Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno?
Max Horkheimer, 1893–1973, and Theodor Adorno, 1903–1969. Were founding members of the Frankfurt School and they were its leaders in exile. Horkheimer was a cultural critic and social philosopher. Adorno was a cultural critic and musicologist. Horkheimer's ideal was a general understanding of the place of human beings in society. He thought, contrary to orthodox Marxists who often viewed society from the standpoint of the proletariat, that no social class at that time escaped distortions in its social worldview. Adorno thought that Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg's atonal music supported human autonomy or freedom, and he strongly condemned jazz as a form of music for the masses, in contrast, in a way, given their shared view that Marxism should not be culturally centered on the proletariat. It is not surprising that Horkheimer and Adorno collaborated, producing Dialectic of Enlightenment, 1974. They argued that the progress sought in the Enlightenment could not be achieved and that instead the result would be either mass capitalistic vulgarity in a consumer economy, or totalitarian brutality.
How else has Boethius been influential long after his death?
Boethius, 480 c. 525, is best known for his Stoic Neoplatonic text, The Consolation of Philosophy, which he wrote while in prison after having been accused of conspiring with Justinian to overthrow Theodoric. This text was influential throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. It was translated into Anglo-Saxon, German, and French by 1300, and it inspired the writers Dante, Boccaccio, and Chaucer, as well as many, many others. In The Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius defined God as eternal, and the complete and perfect sum total of never-ending life. The created universe had no beginning or end, but existed in time. Boethius resolved the contradiction between the fact that God knows everything and the fact that man has free will by claiming that God has a simultaneous understanding of everything that happens in time, including human freedom.
Who was F. H. Bradley?
Francis Herbert, F. H. Bradley, 1846–1924, was a main architect of 19th-century British idealism. But he was also highly influential as an intuitionist. His principal work was Ethical Studies, 1876, in which he sought to explain how morality can be part of individual consciousness and social institutions. He argued that individuals believe that morality is an intrinsic value, which, depending on their social status, they self-realize in their actions. Good selves could be actualized only if bad selves were suppressed. Therefore, the good self requires the bad self, and morality can never be completely actualized unless oneself dies through surrender to Christianity.
What is the problem of the criterion as put forth by Montaigne?
Montaigne's more theoretical arguments went to the heart of theories of knowledge. All human knowledge comes from sense experience, but all humans perceive things differently. And we are all vulnerable to illusions, dreams, and ordinary distortions of perception. On top of these doubts, Montaigne then introduced the problem of the criterion. We need a criterion to determine if our experience is reliable as a basis for knowledge. But the criterion itself needs to be tested, and for that a second criterion is necessary. And to test this second criterion, a third one is necessary, and on and on. All theoretical and natural philosophers after Montaigne had to come up with some sort of answer to the skeptical problems he raised. The unreliability of sensory information, the disagreement of experts. Cultural differences in values and customs, individual differences in perception, the possibility of human error. And above all, the necessity for a criterion, or neutral standard to settle disagreements.
What did the dialogue between the pre-Socratics reveal about their philosophy?
The philosophy of the pre-Socratics can be viewed as one big intellectual conversation. We can see the historical development of their ideas and a kind of progress in their thinking over time if we consider them in, more or less, chronological order. A pattern was thus developed as each generation of students carefully examined and criticized the ideas of their teachers, as well as the rivals of their teachers. Ever since the pre-Socratics, philosophers have thought about the ideas of their predecessors and tried to perfect or disprove them.
Was Thomas more serious about his utopian vision?
Although Sir Thomas More, 1478 to 1535, later, St. More, was strongly influenced by Desiderius Erasmus, 1466 to 1536, mockery of scholasticism. His ideas in his most important work, Utopia, are quite sober and serious. The work itself became a model for modern descriptions of the ideal society. Like Erasmus, More returned to Greek philosophy and early Christianity for ideals of human life. More sought inspiration from Epicurus, 341 to 271 BCE, and, like his guide, extolled simple and natural pleasures among friends with the same tastes. The principal narrator of Utopia is Raphael Hythlodaeus, a well-traveled philosopher who is fond of Plato, Plutarch, and Aristotle, as well as the Roman intellectuals Seneca and Cicero. The island of Utopia is a completely egalitarian, communistic society. Reflecting More's values, Utopia favors rights for women, traditional families, and a reliance on Christian virtues to support its main purpose of achieving happiness for all in their earthly lives.
Who was Pyrrho of Elis?
Pyrrho, c. 360 to 275, started out as a painter and then became interested in Democritus. c. 460 to 371 BCE, atomism. He traveled with Alexander the Great to the east, where he studied with the gymnosophists in India and the Magi in Persia. He had students but left no written work. When he would refuse to judge whether a chariot headed his way would hit him, his students often had to rescue him at the last second.
What were Bernard Bosanquet's main ideas concerning social philosophy?
Humans, said Bosanquet, can only achieve their individual goals within communities, both individually and collectively. We all wish for those things that produce harmony where once there were conflicting desires. On a community level, this is the general will. Being ruled by the general will results in liberty. The general will is the foundation of the modern state that has as its aim the actualization of what is best for all of its citizens.
What do critics of the deep ecological and animal value views claim?
William F. Baxter, a law professor who passed away in 1998, argued in People or Penguins? The Case for Maximum Pollution, 1974, that the cost of a pollution-free society would be harmful to humans. He assumed that humanism requires that humans are what matter above all else. Baxter expressed a general critical view of environmentalism held by human beings who do not believe that animals have intrinsic worth or rights equal to those of humans.
Who was Herbert Spencer?
Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903, was a philosopher and social reformer who was assistant editor-in-chief of The Economist. He also wrote for the Westminster Review, while George Eliot was its editor. Spencer was an atheist, without any training in the humanities. And he believed that only science could yield useful knowledge. In his Ethics, he combined Jeremy Bentham's, 1748-1832, version of utilitarianism with John Stuart Mill's 1806-1873, view that happiness is the true end. Spencer thought that pleasure and pain were evidence of happiness or unhappiness. Spencer is best known for his evolutionary views that predated Charles Darwin's publication of On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, 1859. Spencer's main publications were works he published in his major project System of Synthetic Philosophy. Beginning in the 1850s, and 1884's The Man versus the State.
Why is George Berkeley considered either an aberration or an obstacle?
Berkeley is an aberration insofar as his ideas defy common sense to the point of being dismissible as simple absurdities. He is an obstacle insofar as he founded a powerful and enduring school of thought that dominated some areas of philosophy in the 19th century and evolved into very perplexing progressive movements in the 20th and, it now seems, 21st centuries.
What are the issues addressed by Latino-Latina/Hispanic American philosophy?
Identity, immigration, the experience of multinational persons, and the nature of cultural difference are considered. As well, there are unique feminist issues for Latina Americans and questions centered on the difference between race, as false biology, and ethnicity, as culture.
What was new about the thinking of the pre-Socratics?
The pre-Socratics looked for natural explanations of natural facts and events. Instead of relying on mythological accounts of the actions of the gods to explain the nature of our existence. Because of this approach, the pre-Socratics can be regarded as the first Western scientists. Even though, today, many of their theories sound quaint compared to contemporary science.
What was Bertrand Russell's theory of knowledge?
Russell distinguished between two kinds of knowledge. Knowledge by acquaintance was direct knowledge of sense data, mental states, thoughts, and feeling. More indirect knowledge by description was ultimately based on knowledge by acquaintance. For example, I have knowledge by acquaintance of this page as I am typing it into my computer. But knowledge by description of Burma, where I have never been.
What was Karl Popper's theory of falsification?
Popper, 1902 to 1994, did not think it mattered how hypotheses were inspired or arrived at. So induction was not necessary for their formation. In fact, he thought that the more bold and imaginative a hypothesis, the more scientific it was because it would be possible to specify what would falsify it. He argued that science progresses through a process of falsification, or if hypotheses withstand crucial tests, then corroboration, but never confirmation. Hypotheses or theories that cannot be falsified, such as religious, Marxist, or Freudian claims, according to Popper, could never qualify as scientific claims.
Who were the Philosophes?
The term philosophy can and has been applied to virtually all intellectuals who advocated change in the world order during the decades leading up to the American and French revolutions. In that sense, David Hume, Jeremy Bentham, and Benjamin Franklin were all philosophes. However, to tell a manageable history of philosophy, it is useful to narrow the term down to the French encyclopedists and Adam Smith, Edward Gibbon, Gotthold Lessing, and Cesare Beccaria.
What were the important themes in early 20th century analytic philosophy?
Analytic philosophy before World War II began with a rejection of British idealism via G. E. Moore's, 1873–1958, well-received common-sense philosophy and a new rigor in theories of meaning. Introduced by the empiricist Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970. The doctrine of logical atomism, as developed by Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. 1889–1951, flourished for a while. Logical atomism was dependent on truth-functional logic for its explication. In other words, analytic philosophers generally turned to logic as the science par excellence that set the standard for philosophy.
What was Paul Feyerabend's view of science?
He did not think it was possible to construct a philosophy of science that set out invariable rules for scientific progress. Instead, he argued that the most important scientific revolutions proceeded in violation of standing accepted methodological rules. He believed, for example, that the consistency criterion, which posits that new theories not contradict older ones, is not a rational rule but an aesthetic one, insofar as old theories have been falsified. Feyerabend also argued against Karl Popper's, 1902–1994, idea of falsification on the grounds that interesting theories are not constructed in accordance with all relevant facts. One example of this was how the Renaissance astronomer Galileo Galilei, 1564–1642, and his followers disregarded some of their telescopic observations during the construction of their optical theory. Feyerabend claimed that Lakato's notion of a research program was a form of his own anarchism in disguise. He dedicated against method. Outline of an Anarchistic Theory of Knowledge, 1975, to Lakatos as his fellow anarchist.
What is the romantic story involving Peter Abelard and Héloïse?
The story of Peter Abelard, 1079–1149. And Héloïse chronicles one of the most poignant romantic relationships in the Western tradition. It was referred to in the 1999 movie about a doorway that leads into the head of the actor John Malkovich. Being John Malkovich, in which John Cusack's character refers to Peter and Héloïse in the salacious dialogue of one of his marionette shows. Well before this movie, Cole Porter wrote, as Abelard said to Héloïse, "Don't forget to drop a line to me, please." In real life, Héloïse had written to Abelard, "The name of wife may seem more sacred or more worthy, but sweeter to me will always be the word lover, or, if you will permit me, that of concubine or whore." Abelard, at the peak of his fame and popularity, assumed the position of tutor to Héloïse. They fell in love, and he is said to have seduced her. She became pregnant, and they were secretly married. Eloise's uncle discovered the whole affair. Claiming to be incensed by the secrecy of their marriage, he publicly denounced Abelard and then had him castrated. Peter himself recounted these events in his autobiographical work, Historia Calamitatum. Abelard told Eloise to become a nun and he himself became a monk. They carried on a correspondence of passionate love letters. Eloise was more enamored of Abelard than he was of her. Although castration was not an unusual punishment for the kind of betrayal of trust committed by Abelard, he was humiliated by his maiming for the rest of his life, and more or less retreated into his studies. Eloise became the highly successful abbess of a convent. Peter and Eloise were eventually buried together.
What are some key facts about Edmund Husserl's life and career?
Husserl was born in Prosnitz, Moravia, which became part of Czechoslovakia after World War I and is now in the Czech Republic. His family was Jewish. Husserl studied mathematics in Leipzig and Berlin, and then got his PhD in Vienna in 1883, writing contributions to the calculus of variations that year. For the next 2 years, he studied psychology and philosophy with Franz Brentano. 1837 to 1917, and then went to the University of Halle for his habilitation. Preparation for university teaching, under a student of Brentano. He wrote on the concept of number, which he revised 4 years later, in 1891, as Philosophy of Arithmetic. In 1886 Husserl converted to Christianity, taking the name Edmund Gustav Albrecht Husserl. The next year, he married Malvine Steinschneider, who was to prove a valuable source of information about his work and intentions to academic colleagues. They had a daughter and 2 sons. In 1901, the Husserls moved to the University of Göttingen. He was promoted to Ordenlichen professor in 1906, and the next year he traveled to Italy to see Brentano. Husserl was at this time in correspondence with Wilhelm Dilthey and leading mathematicians, as well as philosophers, about their work and his. German psychologist and philosopher Karl Jaspers. 1883 to 1969, visited him in 1913, the same year Ideen was published. While visiting his son Wolfgang, who was injured in World War I, Husserl experienced nicotine poisoning. In 1916 Husserl was appointed to a professorship in Freiburg. Wolfgang was killed in action that year. For the next 2 years, Edith Stein was his assistant, as was philosopher Martin Heidegger. 1889 to 1976, for whom he obtained a lectureship and helped get an assistant professorship in 1919. The next year, his son Gerhard was wounded, although he recovered. Over the following decade, Husserl and Heidegger were in contact, exchanging ideas and manuscripts. Because of his Jewish birth, in 1933 the German government barred Husserl from using the library at Freiburg University or any other German academic institution. Although after an immediate public outcry, he was reinstated a week later by a decree. Husserl resigned from the Deutsche Akademie several months after that. His leaving was not only a matter of what had happened at Freiburg, but of the growing danger to all Jews in Germany at that time. He was then appointed to the School of Philosophy at the University of Southern California, but declined because his assistant, Eugen Fink, was not permitted to accompany him. Husserl was not allowed to participate in the Paris Congress of Philosophers. In 1937, at his cremation the next year, Eugen Fink eulogized him. Fink had been Husserl's dedicated and collaborative research assistant for 10 years. In his own work, Fink was to eventually turn from Husserl's philosophical perspective to that of Heidegger. Husserl had only published 6 books during his lifetime, but he had a huge collection of papers and manuscripts. Fearing that the Nazis would destroy them, the Belgian philosopher Herman Leo van Breda (1911–1974) took them out of Germany, where they became part of the Husserl archives in Louvain after World War II.
Who was Pyrrho of Elys?
Pyrrho, c. 360 to 275, started out as a painter and then became interested in Democritus. c. 460 to 371 BCE, atomism. He traveled with Alexander the Great to the east, where he studied with the gymnosophists in India and the Magi in Persia. He had students but left no written work. When he would refuse to judge whether a chariot headed his way would hit him, his students often had to rescue him at the last second.
What was Thomas Hobbes' life like?
Hobbes' father was the vicar of Westport, but he had to leave for London after his involvement in a brawl outside his church. Thomas's uncle, the alderman of Malmesbury, financed his education. Hobbes studied Greek and Latin at Oxford University from 1602 to 1608, and after graduating he took the position of tutor to Lord Cavendish's oldest son, William. Lord Cavendish, Earl of Devonshire, was to become Hobbes' main patron throughout his working career. With William, he travelled to Europe in 1610, when Johannes Kepler first published his system of the elliptical shape of planetary orbits, and Galileo Galilei was reporting his observations with telescopes. Hobbes met English statesman, scientist, and philosopher Francis Bacon after he returned to England and agreed with him about the need to discard Aristotelian views of science. However, Hobbes did not subscribe to Bacon's inductive method. Bacon believed that scientific knowledge could be built up from observation. Hobbes, in contrast, was to develop a system of knowledge beginning from the first principles of matter and motion from which the nature of experience could be deduced. Hobbes then began reading the classics and translated Thucydides' history into English in 1628. By this time, Sir Cavendish had died and his widow dismissed Hobbes to cut expenses. So, Hobbes went back to Europe to work for another noble family as tutor to Sir Clinton's son. He became interested in geometry as a method for conveying a philosophical system. His interest in astronomy was piqued when he met the astronomer, priest, and philosopher Pierre Gassendi, 1592–1655, as well as Galileo. From that exchange, he conceived the idea of applying the principles of the science to the human world, specifically to politics and history. He wrote little treatise, 1637, an explanation of sensation set out in a geometrical form, which was both an attack on Aristotle's theory, and his own original thought. He thought that the cause of all sensation was changes in motion of insensible particles. In 1650, Hobbes published his Elements of Law in 2 parts. The psychological treatise Human Nature and De Corpore Politico, which defended unified government. This began a period when Hobbes' life was in danger as politics shifted. Because he was suspected of atheism on account of his materialism and was disliked because of his own dislike of Catholics. Overall, his defense of a strong monarchy set Parliament against him. Meanwhile, he was briefly the mathematical tutor to Charles II. Before he became king, and he published his magnum opus, Leviathan, 1651. Between 1645 and 1663, Hobbes became involved in several protracted and bitter controversies with other thinkers. He disputed the question of free will with John Bramwell, Bishop of Derry. 2 Oxford dons were angry with him, John Wallis, a professor of geometry, was scathing about Hobbes' attempts to square the circle. This was the problem dating from antiquity of devising a method for constructing a square with an area equal to the area of any given circle. Seth Ward, professor of astronomy, was opposed to Hobbes' entire philosophy. Hobbes played tennis until he was 75, rewrote his autobiography in Latin verse at the age of 84. And at 86 published translations of the Iliad and Odyssey in verse.